Pittsburgh kid. We think he's got real local connections here. And so you can see from our lectures that we really cover the game. And all of them are associated with the history of Squirrel, and all of them we want to make everybody who lives here more aware of and understanding of just what a wonderful community that we're in. And I'm talking about this whole set of talks. We're taking our annual August break next month, and then we'll start up in September. And expect to hear from us as we get our lineup going. But now let's turn to tonight. And I must admit, I have never been a boxer. But I did look at the official Billy Cohen website, which has had 40,192 visitors since it was begun. And truly this gives you just a little idea of the legendary character that Billy Cohen is. We are going to hear from his official biographer, Paul Kennedy, tonight. And so I'm going to let Paul take the stage to talk about the information that he uncovered while researching the life of this East Liberty native who did live many of his years in Squirrel Hill. So let me tell you just a word or two about Paul, so that he doesn't come here unannounced and you don't know who he is. You may recognize Paul F. Kennedy. You might recognize his name from his byline that you may have seen in the Pittsburgh Tribune Review for the many articles that he wrote, especially on boxing history. You may also recognize his byline from the poetry, from fiction that he has written and had published in a variety of magazines. And you may recognize his byline from the first novel he published, A Pittsburgh Gamble, a novel that takes place in Pittsburgh during the 1960 Pirate Yankee World Series. You might recognize Paul from his school connection because he's a graduate of Central Catholic High School in Pittsburgh, from Indiana University in Indiana, Pennsylvania. He has a master's degree from Carnegie Mellon Museum, and he currently lives in Greensburg. So there you might have some school connections with Paul F. Kennedy and recognize him from his yearbook pictures. You might also recognize him just as a person you've seen walking along the streets, because Paul has spent his teenage years in Point Breeze.
Yeah, Point Breeze.
And so, he's not an unfamiliar person.
I did hang out in Squirrel Hill at times when I was a teenager.
And I'll just say, by the way, that we've given the audience here the memories that you might share of Billy Cohen. You may be able to hear some nuance from people.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you can tell us what kind of format you want to have.
Okay. Well, I was just going to give a talk and about Billy Conn and about the book I wrote, and then just maybe have some questions, discussion.
You like the questions afterwards?
Yeah.
And when people get a hold of your book afterwards?
Yeah, afterwards. Yeah, I have books on sale here if anyone wants to buy them.
And you can also buy them.
Yeah, you can buy them.
Expensive.
Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Barnes & Noble Squirrel Hill, and several other Barnes & Nobles in Pittsburgh.
With that, welcome, Paul.
Okay. Okay, I want to thank the Squirrel Hill Historical Society for having me tonight. My name is Paul Kennedy. I wrote Billy Conn, the Pittsburgh Kid. The book was just published a few months ago. I'm not sure how many of you know who Billy Conn is, but Billy Conn was a legendary Pittsburgh sports figure. He was a famous boxer who fought in the 1930s and 1940s. This was a time when Pittsburgh produced a lot of great boxers. You wouldn't know that today. We have probably none, except one who's in prison. But in those days, Pittsburgh was other than New York, was the best city for producing boxers. There was Billy Conn, Fritzy Zivik, who was a world champion, Charlie Burley, Teddy Rose. All those guys are in the Hall of Fame, and very legitimately in the Hall of Fame. at one time between 1939 and 1941, 5 of the 8 world boxing champions were from the Pittsburgh area. And there were only eight titles at that time. There's like 68 now or something. But at that time, Pittsburgh was fairly dominant in boxing. Billy Conn's connection to Squirrel Hill is that he lived here for most of his adult life. He was born and grew up in East Liberty, not far from here. He moved to Squirrel Hill in 1946 after his second fight with Joe Louis, when he basically retired from boxing, and lived here and pretty much until his death in 1993. There was a short period of time, about 2 to 3 years, when they moved to Las Vegas, and he was a greeter at the casinos out there and that sort of thing. And the family really didn't take to that kind of life very well, and they moved back to Pittsburgh, where they belonged. The Pittsburgh kid never left Pittsburgh. It was always in his heart. Another person who was very important in Billy Conn's life was his manager and trainer, who was named Johnny Ray. His real name was Harry Pitler, and he also lived in Squirrel Hill for much of his adult life on Dallas Avenue. He had grown up in the Hill District. He was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants, and he had been a top boxer in his day in the 1920s. He was a featherweight, and he became the trainer of Billy Conn, and pretty much of a father figure too. He started training Billy Conn from about age 15, right out of grade school, and they were together for the rest of their lives. And like Betty told you, I grew up in Point Breeze. I am currently a disability hearing officer for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I live in Greensburg now. She told I went to St. Bede, right down the road here, Central, IUP, CMU. I used to see Billy Conn fairly often as a kid. I'd see him walking the streets of Squirrel Hill. A couple times he spoke at banquets at St. Bede, and he'd give a talk at a sports banquet. And I was always impressed by this guy who was such a legend, and he was just right here, walking around among us. My dad used to tell me tales about him and the other fighters. I wrote a lot of local history articles for the Tribune Review for Focus magazine, and several of those articles were about Pittsburgh boxers, about the old great fighters, the Zivic brothers and Harry Greb. And I was always interested in boxing, and what started me on this book was that I wanted to read a biography of Billy Conn, the great Billy Conn. So I searched for one, internet search, and I discovered that there really was none. And I was amazed by that. There was one thing written a few years ago by a banker named Knox McConnell. It was called The Banker and the Boxer or something like that. It was really about his relationship with Billy. It wasn't a real biography of Billy Conn. So I thought somebody has to write this. So I figured since I had some background in writing boxing, I would do it. And I contacted the Conn family, and they had a tremendous wealth of information that I used for research. Billy Conn, from the time he started his professional career at about age 16, he kept a scrapbook of articles about him that were in the newspaper. And they must have 500 at least, I would say, articles about him from all different newspapers, the local Pittsburgh papers, papers all around the country, that go all the way through his career. So that was a wealth of information. And also, I did some research at the library, the Carnegie Library, on the microfilm, going through the old newspapers. And plus talking to members of his family. His widow, Mary Louise, is still living. His sons knew a lot about his career and the whole history of Billy Conn. They knew him as a person. Billy Conn is basically known for the Joe Louis fights. Billy Conn is this guy, from what most people know, who almost won the heavyweight title from Joe Louis. But there's a lot more to Billy Conn than that. I mean, had Billy Conn never fought Joe Louis and only fought as a middleweight and light heavyweight, he would still be one of the greatest fighters of all time. I mean, he was a great fighter before he even got in the ring with Joe Louis. He was every bit as great as the very greatest, like Sugar Ray Robinson, Harry Greb, Ali, Lewis, except that he didn't fight as long as they did. His career was interrupted by World War II, so he lost 4 years there, and after that he hadn't trained, he was in the Army, and he just wasn't as good. But from the period 1938 to 1942, nobody could beat him. He was, in 1936, he had his first big fight against Fritzy Zivik. They were both very young then, and Billy was a middleweight, Fritzy was a welterweight, and he beat Fritzy Zivik. It was a big local draw fight, and they made a big deal out of it. He was only 19 years old at the time, and in 1937, he started fighting all these top middleweights who had all been champions. They were champs, or they were just had been champs, and he beat them all. He was 19 and 20 years old when he beat all the best middleweights in the world. Then he started beating some of the light heavyweights. He had a few losses in there, but avenged those and came back and beat those guys. In 1939, he had what I think is one of the best years ever in boxing history of anybody. He was 8-0 that year. Everybody he beat was really an all-time great fighter. There were 2 middleweight champions at that time due to a jurisdictional dispute, and he fought them. It wasn't a title bout because they didn't want to risk the title. They did that a lot those days. So he fought them over the weight, and he beat them both twice. So he was still only 20 years old. He was the best middleweight in the world, and one of the best ever. Then he fought light heavyweights. He won the light heavyweight title, which is 175 pounds. He beat Emilio Bettina in that fight at Madison Square Garden. And then he fought him again at Forbes Field in September of 1939. 1940, he was so dominant as a light heavyweight, nobody could touch him. He would beat everybody easily. He was so fast and had so much stamina that nobody could stay with him. So even though he was only 170 pounds, he decided to try fighting the heavyweights for more of a challenge, and because that's where the big money was. So in 1940, he beat 3 of the top 10 heavyweights, despite the fact that they were a lot bigger than him. He knocked out Pastor, who had gone the distance with Joe Louis once, and was a really talented fighter. He knocked him out in the 13th round in just a vicious mugging, low blows and everything. And then he beat 2 of the other top heavyweights, Lee Savold and Al McCoy. So they started talking about Billy Conn fighting Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a national hero at this time. He was a long-time heavyweight champion. He had beaten Max Schmeling in what really was the biggest fight of the century. They talk about fights of the century, every 5 or 10 years, but this had political ramifications for the world. This was a time when Nazi Germany was very threatening. In 1938, Max Schmeling was supposed to be the Superman who could beat anybody. Joe Louis was this black American, and they made it into a big political fight. Hitler was behind Max Schmeling, and Louis won that in a first-round knockout. Schmeling had beaten him 2 years before that, so it was a comeback for Joe Louis. And Joe Louis seemed invincible after that. He defended the title altogether 25 times successfully, and he knocked out most of the people. He was really a great heavyweight. He may have been the greatest of all time, either him or Ali, in my opinion. So they started talking about Billy Conn fighting Joe Louis. There was nobody else who seemed to be anywhere near Joe Louis, so there was this light heavyweight guy, even though he only weighed about 170 pounds. They said he was so good that maybe he could give Joe Louis a fight. So they signed for the fight with Billy Conn and Joe Louis for the Polo Grounds in New York City. That was where the New York Giants played at that time. It was a baseball stadium. At that time, it was a tumultuous time in Billy Conn's life. He was trying to marry the woman he loved, who was Mary Louise Smith. Her father was vehemently opposed to this, and her father was quite a rough character himself. He told Billy Conn to stay away from her. He told her to stay away from him. They started seeing each other secretly. When the father-in-law found out, he was very angry in public about it. His name was Greenfield Jimmy Smith, and he grew up in Greenfield. He lived on Beechwood Boulevard at that time because he had been successful in various businesses, nightclubs and things like that, a little bootlegging. But he had been a baseball player, professional baseball player, and played about 10 years in the major leagues, mostly as a utility infielder. But he was more known as a fighter. He was a tough guy who would, sometimes get into fights in baseball games, and he wasn't even that big, but he seemed like he could beat anybody. He really liked Billy Conn, actually, and introduced Billy Conn to his daughter, but he didn't think anything would come of it because she was so much younger than him. She was about 15 and he was 21. Billy Conn, the first time he set eyes on her, he told her, "I'm going to marry you." And she told him he was crazy. And she thought he was crazy. And I've talked to her a lot about this. She said he had no place in her life. She had these preppy high school boyfriends that she hung around with, and here's this guy, this boxer who's a national celebrity. She just thought he was like a guy being nice to her. But he never gave up on that, and he really was struck with her, and never got over that. So they eventually did marry and eloped, and her father was furious, and they took off and got married in Philadelphia. They couldn't get married in Pittsburgh. They were both very Catholic, and they wanted a church wedding. And Greenfield Jimmy Smith, according to the family lore, threatened the Bishop of Pittsburgh. He told him, if any priest, if you or any priest in this diocese marries them, I will kill you. And no priest in the diocese would do it. So they snuck off to Philadelphia and found someone there who would do it. And they were married. That was 1941. They were married till the day he died, 1993. But that was going on in his life. He was training to fight Joe Louis in a huge fight against somebody who he was a heavy underdog against. He was having this thing going on with the love of his life and her father, and at the same time his mother was dying of cancer. So all this was going on as he was training for the Louis fight. The Joe Louis fight, I'm sure some of you have heard of that, but maybe some of you haven't. It's considered one of the all-time classic fights. Billy Conn was about 169 pounds. Normally he weighed around low 170s, but he had really trained hard for this fight. He was down to 169. Joe Louis weighed around 200 pounds. He normally was more like 205 to 210, but he lost weight for this fight because Billy Conn was so fast. He wanted to be in great shape to try to keep up with him. Billy Conn was winning the fight. From about the third round on, he started outboxing Louis, and Louis couldn't solve him. And this guy was smaller, but he was hitting him inside. Louis couldn't fire his long-range shots. Conn was just so fast. He was landing all these shots on Louis and not getting hit that much back. So he started getting very confident, because it had always happened for Billy Conn. In all these big fights, he got in his groove and he ended up winning, and he ended up controlling the fight. He sort of sensed the same thing was happening against Joe Louis, even though this guy was one of the greatest knockout power punchers who ever lived. He could take you out with one punch, left hand or right hand. So Billy Conn was fairly well ahead. In the 12th round, he really had a great round against Louis. I mean, it was just very one-sided. He landed a 5-punch combination toward the end of the round that had Louis staggered. Louis, the great puncher, was staggered, holding on to Billy Conn, about to fall down. After that 12th round, Billy Conn said his corner, "I'm going to knock him out. I got him." And they said, "No, don't think like that. That's crazy." And but he went out and he tried to knock him out. And it wasn't like he went out there and got crazy. He looked for the right openings, and then he started slugging with Louis. Louis slugged him back. They were both slugging with each other. Billy Conn could have backed off several times during that round and probably danced away and won the fight, but he kept trying to slug it out with Louis that whole round. There was times when they just stood toe-to-toe and threw about 25 punches at each other, which was phenomenal to fight Louis like that, because he was such a great puncher. But Billy Conn, despite his small size, had a great ability to take a punch. They call it a chin. He had a great chin. He had a neck that was 18 inches. bigger than Joe Louis's neck. I think that's part of the reason why he could take a punch so well. Joe Louis knocked him out in the 13th round. So that's how that fight ended. Billy Conn became a great hero from that fight, though, because it captured the nation's attention. You know, this smaller guy who was winning and then took the big risk and tried to win by the knockout. You know, it just captured everybody's attention. He became the big story. He starred in a movie shortly after that called The Pittsburgh Kid. It was not a biography of him, it was a fictional story about a boxer somewhat like him, but he played the lead role. And he got to Hollywood, he got to know people in Hollywood, he became very close friends with Bob Hope and Robert Taylor, people like that, eventually with Frank Sinatra. But before the movie, shortly after the first Joe Louis fight, his mother did die. She died of cancer, and you know, that was a very sad thing for him because he was very close to his mother and you know, made no bones about it. He was, you know, always bragged to people how much he loved his mother, and they were very close. So it was a pretty devastating thing for him. He's still only 23 years old. So he went through all this thing in 1941. After the movie, it was late in 1941, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Lots of people volunteered, were drafted into the Army. Billy Conn volunteered for the Army, as did Joe Louis in 1942. So he would stay in the Army for the next 4 years until the end of the war. He did some exhibitions during the war. He boxed exhibitions, and he visited wounded prisoners. He was a popular celebrity, and he would go and visit the wounded prisoners. He logged like something like 50,000 miles visiting prisoners. But after the war, he just wasn't the same fighter he had been, and he really didn't have the desire anymore to get back to that level. You know, when you lay off for 4 years like that. They did organize a fight for him with Joe Louis, a rematch, which was going to be extremely lucrative right after the war. And it ended up not being a great fight. He got knocked out in the 8th round. He lost most of the rounds. It was nothing like the first fight where he was so fast and brilliant. Part of the reason was that the layoff took away more of his skills because he relied more on speed and reflexes, whereas Louis was more power. So the layoff hurt Billy Conn more than it did Joe Louis. And after that, he retired. He retired from boxing. After his boxing career, he got involved in a few business deals and things like that, but never really worked. He once bragged that he never worked a day in his life, which he, was from grade school. He went into the boxing ring, and after he quit boxing, he never really had to work. He made a lot of money on the second Joe Louis fight, and through some business deals, he was secure financially. Billy Conn became, a Pittsburgh legend, a character. He was known as, someone who was very quotable and, knew the Roonies and hung out with Joey Diven and all that sort of thing. And a lot of that, that stuff is nice, and it's, people like hearing that, but in some ways it obscured what was really most important about Billy Conn is how great of a fighter he was. He truly was one of the greatest fighters of all time. Even the AP poll of the greatest fighters of the century had him in the top 10 fighters who ever participated in boxing. In my book, I attempt to show this. I have a lot of detail on his fights, which show what he did in all these different fights, how he beat all these great fighters. But there's also a lot about his personal life and his charm and that sort of thing. Billy Conn, as a fighter, was extremely fast of both hand and foot. He had phenomenal stamina. He never seemed to tire out. He could go a hard 15 rounds. He had great boxing skills and ring intelligence, and he had that famous chin with the 18-inch neck. Nobody could knock him out, except Joe Louis after about 25 shots in a row. Some of the interesting stories about Billy Conn after he retired, the one that people seem to like the best is one that took place right here in Squirrel Hill in a convenience store across from Colfax School. He was 72 years old. He and his wife had gone to St. Philomena's Church for a novena to pray for their daughter, who was sick with cancer at that time. On the way home, they stopped in the convenience store to get coffee, and Mary Louise told me the story of how it happened. She was back getting coffee. He was holding a newspaper up near the counter. Some young kid, 18 years old, came in and tried to rob the store. He pulled a gun on the owner, said, "Give me all your money." You know, there was this old guy standing there with a newspaper. He didn't know or care who that was, and it didn't seem like he was getting threatened. Billy Conn said to, you know, he's holding the gun on the guy. Billy Conn says, "Hey, you can't do that." As soon as the kid turns, he cracks him and knocks him down into the display. And the gun goes flying, his wallet goes flying. He runs out of the store, and they did get him because they got his wallet. So he was still the Pittsburgh kid even at age 72. 72 years old, he knocks down an 18-year-old kid. That was 1991. 1990. There's a lot of other stories about Billy Conn. I don't know how true they all are. One of the more interesting stories too is when he came back from the army in 1942. He had a child by his wife, and they were having a christening party at the Smith home. And Art Rooney decided that they should have a big makeup session for Greenfield, Jimmy Smith, and Billy Conn, that they needed to patch things up. You know, Jimmy Smith had never forgiven him for marrying his daughter. So Billy Conn came, and they shook hands and everything, and everything seemed to be okay. Then Jimmy Smith started drinking a little bit, and he started bad-mouthing Billy Conn, and telling him that you're no good, and you shouldn't be married to my daughter, and this sort of thing, and I can kick your ass and that sort of thing. But finally, he provoked him so much that Billy Conn just went at him and threw a punch and hit him on the top of the head, broke his left hand, and then there was chaos, and they broke up the fight. But the reason that was important, I forgot to tell you, he had a rematch with Lewis scheduled for 1942 after the big 41 fight. And he was in training for that. Because of that broken hand from fighting his father-in-law, that fight was off. And they never had it again until 1946, when he had lost much of his skill. So, that's another famous story at the christening. And the baby from that christening is right here tonight. Billy's son, Tim Conn, is with us tonight.
An interesting fact, Jimmy Smith was the one that introduced him. He was a big supporter of my father. He had never seen the seashore before, and he had a home in Ocean City, New Jersey. And he asked my father, "Why don't you come to the seashore and see the ocean? Stay at my home as my guest," which he did. But he had I think my mother might have been very young, 16, in that range. Asked her out on a date, and I think the first date, he said, "Someday I'm going to marry you." And she said, "Well, I think you're crazy, and don't fighters become punching anyway?" Then he asked for another date. Then the grandfather told him, "Well, I think you just better never come around here anymore." And then then from then on, really had a dislike for him until they did make up at my christening. They did become friends.
Yeah, they did later on.
Yeah, later
after.
on.
They were good friends during the second Lewis fight, so
Yes.
they made up something.
They did make up. It was through Art Rooney, the founder of the Steelers. His connection with Squirrel Hill, he actually lived in the home where we were raised on Denniston between Darlington and Ford's. There's a small section there of two Tudor homes. And was there actually from 1941, I think, till he died, 93. He loved it here in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh. He always said Pittsburgh was a place you couldn't wait to leave, but then you couldn't wait to get back. And he would go to Rose's drugstore and get cigarettes. I remember this story. He was slipping a little bit, and he was a pretty heavy smoker later in life, and all of a sudden, Rose's drugstore burned down. I remember that. And he quit smoking completely. And I said, "Man, how did you quit cold turkey like that?" He said, "Well, Rose's burned down. I don't know where else to get cigarettes." Too lazy to walk.
He has some funny quotes too.
There were some funny quotes in the book, and Paul just did a great job researching the book. A lot of people wanted to do this story, but never and came to fruition. Paul actually was the one that spent a lot of time at the library and the microfilm, dug up stories that I never even knew of. It's more than just a boxing book. It's a book about Pittsburgh and the era of the Depression, the 40s, what it was like living here. A lot of history too. And I thought it was great.
Another funny story I wanted to tell. When he was in Ireland, he was there. Ali was fighting Alvin Lewis there, and they brought Billy Conn over to help publicize it because he was Irish. As he was leaving, there was the reporters asking. This was all on TV and everything. It was a big thing. Billy Conn's leaving. He's leaving for America. And they said, "Well, Billy, what'd you think of Ireland?" He said, "I'm glad my mother didn't miss the boat."
It was all on the government.
Yeah, the government paid him.
He said, "Oh, they're 100 years behind the times." This was in the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
Another funny story. Later in life, when Joe Louis would run into my father in Las Vegas or New York or whatever, he would always say to him, the first thing he'd say, "Is your father-in-law still beating the hell out of you?" They became good friends too.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions for Tim or me?
What was his final record?
His final record, I think, was 67. Actually, it's in the book here. I think he had 75 fights and won 67 of them, something like that. Okay, 64 wins, 12 losses, 1 draw. Most of the losses were early in his career. He was started out fighting people much more experienced than him because that's the way Johnny Ray did it to learn. He said, "You can't learn fighting somebody that's no good."
Yeah, might I ask him about another Pittsburgh fighter real quick?
Yeah.
You had a Charlie Burley.
Yeah.
Him, right? I mean, yeah. They said a lot of people like Robinson and them were ducking them. Do you believe that, or did you hear about that ever? Or?
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
They say that people didn't want to fight him because he was so good. Yeah. Robinson apparently offered him a 3-fight deal if he would throw the first fight, supposedly.
Yeah. Did your dad like taught you about boxing too a lot too? Once in a while, do you know a little bit about boxing too?
No, a little bit, yes, but he didn't want us to continue on. He thought it was too dangerous. He didn't want us to keep.
Because there was like a Sports Center, I think, on him, right? I saw some guy named Tom Conn. Maybe that was you. I don't know. But
That was probably me.
That was you? Yeah.
Tim,
yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I understand that Billy and Harry both worked out at the old Pittsburgh Lyceum across from Epiphany Church, and I was just wondering if either of you might comment on, did that tend to be kind of a formative influence on him and other young boxers in that time period?
Yeah, definitely, because there were a lot of good boxers. Pittsburgh had a lot of great boxers at that time, and a lot of them worked out together. Even like young Billy Conn, when he was a nobody, he would train with people like the Zivic brothers or Teddy Yarrows, that were good fighters.
All the great fighters from everywhere.
Yeah, from other places. Yeah. There were a lot of fights in Pittsburgh, and great fighters from out of town would come and train there. Yeah.
That was right across the street.
Where did they fight?
The biggest fights were at Forbes Field and Duquesne Gardens, which was right near St. Paul's Cathedral, near where Durante's restaurant is now. That's called Billy Conn Boulevard, right there. There's a street sign there, because he had a lot of big fights at Duquesne Gardens. Go ahead.
Where is he buried?
Calvary Cemetery.
Another question. From a financial point of view, what kind of money would he have made, say, that 46 fight with Joe?
I think he made about $300,000.
350,000.
Yeah.
So that was
Which was a lot of money in 1946.
That got him on the road to
Yeah.
financial success.
Yeah.
Unlike Fritzy Zivic, who I understand pretty long worked penniless, he became.
Yeah, he had to work, I think, later. He worked as a Boilermaker after his career. And,
I think he sold, he was represented for Iron City Beer.
But he gave a lot of money away. He was really.
yeah. He didn't manage his money well, like a lot of fighters do. They grow up poor, and they get money, they give it away, and just enjoy it and don't manage it well. But that didn't happen to Billy Conn, though.
In those days, they didn't have sports agent and managers. They would usually go to gamblers for advice.
Gangsters and gamblers. Sir.
Are there any videos pictures showing him fighting at all?
There are videos of the 2 Joe Louis fights. There are some very bad videos of his earlier fights, like the Bettina Light Heavyweight Championship, that you really can't tell much from it. Really, Tim, have you ever seen anything other than Louis fights?
It's a shame they didn't have those fights filmed in those days.
Yeah.
That's the way, just especially during the Warriors, they wanted to save the silver. It was in made up films, and they skipped on it a lot. Didn't film a lot.
Yeah. There are some films of him training, sparring, that sort of thing.
But there was Joe Louis.
Go ahead, sir.
Do you know what the scoring was going in the 13th round?
He was ahead, what, 7-4-1 and 7-5?
8-4-1, 7-5, 7-5. And 6-6.
6-6, okay, yeah. The thing is, that he wasn't that far ahead, but Joe Louis won some of the early rounds. And at that point, like rounds 7 through 12, he was in control. No, he was really in control and could have won the fight at that point easily.
Yeah, I remember watching it, but I don't remember who he fought.
Yeah.
They're on radio, good radio broadcasts.
You had a question?
Did your sister recover?
No, my sister died in 93.
Same year that
Yeah, same year.
dad.
Same year.
They used to say that, particularly with the heavyweight champion, that you could never, the champ could never lose on a decision. So that might have been.
Yeah, that could have been in his mind.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
They said that would have got robbed anyway, he
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Even if I'd have won the last 2 rounds.
Yeah.
It was always.
He always said he
Yeah.
thought that too.
Especially somebody like Joe Louis, who had held the title so long and was a legend.
The amazing thing is the weight difference. He was
Go
only a
ahead.
big middleweight, maybe
Yeah.
169.
I thought I heard on the news recently, actually, on the radio somewhere, something about that what he said after the loss, that he got knocked out, this is what I heard on the radio. He said, what good is being Irish if you can't do something stupid?
Yes.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Referring to his, just going for it all,
Yeah.
being cocky and that sort of thing. Yes. Yeah, you may have seen me on the, I was on Pittsburgh Today show, was that where you saw that?
It wasn't TV, but I was on.
Jimmy Crank show, radio, WDBE?
Could have been, I don't know.
Another thing he said was I had too much Pittsburgh in me.
It was the only time he never listened to his manager. He said, the manager at the end of the 12th round told him, you haven't won, just box him, you'll win easy. And he said, no, I'm going to knock him out this round. And he said, oh, you're on your own.
Yeah.
Were there particular gyms where these fighters trained?
Well, the better fighters at that time trained at the Pittsburgh Lyceum. Billy Conn started out training at Johnny Ray's gym in East Liberty, which was just a small gym above a storefront, and I think he had about 5 or 6 fighters there. Yeah.
When we first started,
Yeah.
it's right where the giant eagle was now, it was a shame.
I think in Lawrenceville, above the swimming pool at Lawrence Park, there
Yeah,
was a
Willow Club.
Yeah, where Fritzy Civic would.
Right, yeah. The Willow Club in Lawrenceville near Leslie Park was a place where a lot of fighters trained too, a lot of good ones. They had 1920, 4 of the 8 national amateur champions were from that club in Pittsburgh.
What high school did he go to?
He didn't go to high school. He went to Sacred Heart grade school and went right into professional boxing right out of grade school. Just trained full time as a boxer.
When he first went into the gym to try out, Johnny Ray said to him, he was a sort of neighborhood kid, he said, I think you steal things. He said, what am I going to steal around here? A bunch of old sweat shoes. He wouldn't teach him unless he was drunk, because he was a real alcoholic. But he said he knew more drunk than most teachers would know.
Yeah, that was his trainer, Johnny Ray, was an alcoholic.
So he would have to get him down to give him some moonshine before he would teach him what to do.
They said he was drunk in the corner sometimes.
Sometimes it was.
But he knew his
He's a
stuff.
great teacher. In those days, the gate receipts was strictly on the people that went to see the fight. There wasn't any.
Yeah, there wasn't TV money, yeah.
So that depended.
That's why in those days they had the big fights were at outdoor stadiums because you didn't have TV money like you do now. They'd have the bigger fights in the summer in Pittsburgh at Forbes Field and in places like Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds.
So they get 50, 60,000
Yeah.
people.
What would be a typical way that they would split up the receipts?
Usually the champion would get more, something like maybe twice as much as the challenger would get in a title fight. Other than that, if it wasn't a title fight, it'd probably be based on whatever they agreed on whoever was the big draw, or that, whoever held the better, business.
Would the promoter probably keep half of it, or?
Yeah, the promoter would get a lot of it, yeah. But the fighters would probably together get somewhere around 50%, I think, something like that, yeah.
The biggest neighborhood rivalry was the Fritzy Civic fight when he was represented East Liberty and Fritzy Civic represented Lawrenceville. It was a tremendous rivalry.
Yeah.
They had to turn away 3,000 people at Duquesne Gardens. And the gate was, I think, my father got $2,500, which was a lot of money in the Depression.
Yeah.
And he said, I want to be paid in $5 bills, so it's looked like I had been
And that was 1936. I mean, steel workers made up like $500 to $1,000 a year. To get that much for a fight for some poor kid who had nothing was a really big deal.
You could buy a new car for $600.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, did he ever have a chance to get into Hollywood because he's so good looking?
Yeah, he was very handsome. That was another thing that made him such a charismatic star. A very handsome guy, as you can see from his picture. He didn't like the movie The Pittsburgh Kid. He called it a stinker, so he didn't want to get involved with Hollywood anymore because he thought that movie was so bad. And they said that he had copies of the movie, and he kept it at his house, and sometimes would show it to people. Sometimes people would come back and say, "Oh, he showed me that movie." And they said, "Well, he shows that to people he doesn't like."
But he actually was offered a career in Hollywood. But Jack Warner came to him when that movie was filmed and said, "We will teach you how to act, and you can be up for the role of Gentleman Jim Corbett, the Earl Flynn eventually got." And he said, I hate acting. I can't wait to get out of here and go right back to Pittsburgh. And I said, that's probably the biggest mistake you ever made.
Yeah. He did, for that Gentleman Jim Corbett movie, there's a sequence in there that's showing his footwork, this fabulous footwork. They just show his feet, and that was Billy Conn doing his footwork for that movie.
I did too young, too mature to pursue.
Yeah, he was only 23 years old then.
I have a question for, is it Tim? Yeah. I know your dad didn't want to go into boxing as a career, but did you and him talk a lot about the fighters and different things? Was that something that you two shared?
He would say, other sports you can be mediocre and have a good living and get by in it, like baseball or football.
Yeah.
He said, even the best fighters are going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Some of these Steelers have to retire after 2 or 3 concussions, they want to quit. A boxer can have that every week in the gym. If you look at the history of the great fighters, they all sort of have bad deaths, some type of dementia or injury. He said it's just a dangerous sport.
Did he ever idolize another fighter or any?
Harry Greb, we never saw him fight. But he's been
really liked
Harry Greb was a fighter in Pittsburgh in the 1920s who was famous middleweight champion and a great record.
Did his fights cause him
He was
physical problems
pretty
later in
good.
life?
He was very good until he became, I would think, 70. And then he started to forget things. And his short-term memory got bad. If my mother would leave his sight, he would want to know where she is all the time. I mean, he just was very anxious.
Actually, 70's pretty good for a fighter with a long boxing career. Usually that occurs earlier than that.
He was so good.
I think one of the things with him is that he retired at a fairly young age. He was only about 30 years old. So the fighters that fight longer and older tend to have more damage.
Was there ever any film on Harry Greb ever? Or,
No.
There's a training film.
Yeah, I think I saw that.
There is one. And that's about it.
Okay.
There's one. I haven't read the book. I thought it was just great.
Couple questions. Is there a place to see the Pittsburgh Kid, the stinker? I mean,
I didn't think it was that bad.
I didn't think it was that bad either. It's just a lighthearted movie,
It's
typical
not,
of
life story at all.
No,
It's a
it's
story, a
fictional story,
fictitious
yeah.
story of a gangster that,
Yeah, but can you, I mean, is it
oh, yeah,
rentable or,
you
but
can get it.
where do you get it?
On,
Blockbuster?
it was sort of hard to get.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You can search for it on the internet. I don't know.
But I have a copy.
I watched this.
My other question is, Frank Ford says that the story about Billy Conn was very influential in his life. Did you talk with him?
No, I didn't talk with Frank DeFord. He wrote a 1985 Sports Illustrated article about Billy Conn called "The Boxer and the Blonde." It's a beautiful article. I would highly recommend it to anybody. It's still considered one of the best articles ever in Sports Illustrated.
Did you see his recent show, You Write Better Than
I
I
saw
Play?
that. I saw that. That
And
was,
that was, Billy
real
Conn was
good.
really featured
Very
in that.
feature on that.
Yeah.
He said Jimmy Smith didn't want his daughter to marry somebody like him.
Yeah. Well, ironically, Jimmy Smith he grew up poor and tough, and he married some upper class type woman that her father probably didn't want him.
That's true. That's true. People wrote into Sports Illustrated that didn't even like sports or boxing. And they loved that story because it was more of a romance.
Yeah, I have this book called The Life and Hard Times of an Uncrowned Champion by Charlie Trujillo. Yeah. People say that he was the most feared fighter in his generation and stuff. Like it was like, I heard a lot of people were afraid of him. Like,
Well, he was one of the most feared. I mean, he was a great fighter. He never got a shot at the title.
But he did go to New York a couple times, and he was so defensive that he didn't put on an exciting fight.
Yeah, that's the one thing I didn't like about him was he wasn't exciting because he didn't take chances.
Yeah. But was it for like a money thing, or did they fight him, or was it both, or was it because they? Like,
Part of it was money. He didn't have the reputation or the fame to fight somebody like Sugar Ray Rhodes.
Yeah.
Kind of along those lines, I read the book when I did biography.
Thanks.
What sports writers, what boxing fighters do you like? What do you enjoy reading?
What boxing writers?
Yeah.
I like, I liked Frank DeFord. He's not really a boxing writer. I mean, that's a good question.
There used to be so many of them.
Yeah, Bert Sugar is a writer, but he's, I don't know, I'm not all that fond of him. I don't know if you read anything about him. Some of the guys I like that are on television that are trainers and I think are really well informed are Teddy Atlas, Emmanuel Stewart, some people like that. Max Kellerman.
He's good.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, his son, Tom?
Tim.
Tim. When you sat around at home, what was it that your father said about boxing that discouraged you, or he didn't want you to go into that field?
The fact that it was too dangerous that you could get hurt.
That was what he did.
In his day, there wasn't many outs. That was one of the few ways out for somebody.
Yeah, one of the things he said was, I had to fight
Yeah.
to make it. I don't
What
want that
happened,
for
his
my
father,
kids.
when he was 13 or 14, took him to the steel mill, and he showed him the mill. He said, "This is where you're going to spend the rest of your life." And he said, "That scared me so much." He said, "I went to the nearest gym and just asked for a tryout."
How was your family, Tim, besides you? You and your
Two brothers.
Two brothers.
This is for Tim. Tim, is there much memorabilia about your dad?
Yeah,
And who has that now?
I probably have a lot.
Yeah, most of it.
I gave you a lot of the,
Yeah.
of the research.
Yeah. Yeah, he loans a lot of it to me. I saw everything they have. It's really a wealth.
Could you describe some of it?
Well, there's a scrapbook that has hundreds of articles. I would estimate about 500 articles dating back to 1934, all the way up to 46, and even later. Hundreds of articles of good information from newspapers. There's the light heavyweight championship belt. There's also a section on Pittsburgh boxers that features Billy Conn in the Western Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame down in the Strip District.
And then all the Red Magazine Fighter of the Year award, a lot of trophies, that
Yeah.
type of thing. Virginia Memorial.
A lot of pictures.
A lot of great pictures.
Yeah.
A lot of really good pictures. Some of them are on the website.
Yeah, there's a Billy Conn website, billyconn.net.
Oh,
Website has a lot of pictures on it, a lot of information about him.
A lot
Who runs that?
That was a project my son told about. I said, you can learn computers, just do some type of a website, on your grandfather, and you learn about him, and you learn how to, hired somebody to help him learn about how to do a website.
It's a very good website.
Organized it, and it's a real good website. The different categories, great photos in it.
A lot of articles on him from the past, and a lot of pictures.
He got his first comment. People can comment.
Yeah.
And send comments. He said, just so email me. I said, who? He said, George Foreman. He said, great job writing on your website.
Ma'am, did you?
Well, I don't know, Google was available when you were doing your research, but have you tried Googling him? And if so, what did you find?
Googling him, you can find some articles on him. Not as much as I found in the Pittsburgh Library, though, because there's old newspapers from the 1930s and 40s. You can't really get that online. You can get some of it in the New York Times, not the Pittsburgh papers, which had much more about him.
eBay. I've been into eBay. People are selling things on eBay. And there could be 30 or 40 different things on there that people want to sell. Some things, then you get into bidding wars against different. I try to get a few things. It gets expensive. Other people are bidding too. There's all kinds of things that collectors have.
This man back there had a question.
Do you think that with the demise of boxing today, that all these folks, including your dad, will just be forgotten?
Well, it was such a big sport. It was such a big sport with baseball, boxing, and big college football, and that was it. These other sports were so minor in those days.
Well, we hope not, but that boxing is not nearly as popular as it was. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, I was just wanted to let the people know. You're talking about the Carnegie Library in Oakland?
Yes. Yes.
And they should know that there's a Pennsylvania section just separate for that. It'd be easier for them to find that. They have a lot of fighters in that section.
I was wondering, I was wondering if the gloves, the earlier the generation was the gloves less padding back then than it was today?
Maybe not too different.
I don't think they were too different.
17 ounces.
They were?
One pair of those gloves are at the Heinz Historical Museum in the Street District.
Did you ever have any desire to go into Boston?
Well, he put a damper on it pretty quick. Pretty firm.
Does the Heinz new sports museum have anything of
Yes.
this?
Well, they do. They save the belt and a lot of different.
Yes, they have a big cutout of Billy Conn, a cardboard cutout, life-size cardboard cutout. And, a lot of pictures. There's a section on the Pittsburgh boxers. Yeah, there's a film of the Conn Lewis fight in the 13th round that runs continuously on the little TV. Hey.
All right.
Thank you very much. If anybody wants to buy the book, I have books here. They are $20 for the hardcover, $15 for the paperback. Autograph is free.
Am I allowed to stay look at it? I don't know if I can get
No, yes. Yeah, right, Singapore and Australia.
How are you doing?